I'm Alicia Jo Rabins, and I'm so happy to be talking with Judith Rosenbaum of Jewish Women's Archive about an often overlooked moment in Miriam's life through text and art. So I think we're just going to say a couple sentences about who we are to start off, and then we'll jump right in. Judith, do you want to say a couple things?
Sure. My name is Judith Rosenbaum. I'm the executive director at the Jewish Women's Archive, and we are just thrilled to be co-sponsoring this event with Alicia and the Global Day of Jewish Learning. JWA is a virtual archive, which means that all of our work is online, although we also do some public programs. And our work is devoted to documenting Jewish women's stories, elevating their voices, and inspiring them to be agents of change. And I'm a huge fan, we're all here at JWA, a huge fan of Alicia and Girls in Trouble, and we're really excited to be able to unpack further the story of Miriam today with all of you.
And I'm a huge fan of JWA and Judith, so I'm thrilled to be working with them and with the Global Day. And Judith referred to Girls in Trouble, which is a musical midrash project that I've been doing for about 5 years now, where I take moments in the lives of women in Torah and I write songs about them in a sort of indie folk art pop milieu. So I try to make them very consciously American contemporary music about these ancient stories of women. And the reason people often ask why is it called Girls in Trouble. So the girls is because I've restricted myself to writing about women. And the trouble is because I tend to write about the more obscure, often challenging, sometimes R-rated, or just kind of difficult moments in their lives that often don't get studied as much, maybe because they're difficult or maybe because so many people stop studying Torah as they get older and we're not ready to study these moments as children, but as adults I think they really can keep us company and kind of enhance our lives, reflect back to us that our own modern lives are complicated in an eternal way and not just a specifically modern way. And this story of Miriam, which happens in Numbers 12, and I know the site is down, so I'm not sure if everyone has access to the source sheet. So if you don't, you can just get any Tanakh, and the book of Numbers, the Bamidbar, chapter 12, is obviously a later moment in Miriam's life after the triumphant song at the sea, after the wandering through the desert and helping to provide water for the people. This kind of shocking thing happens, and I've been pretty much captivated by this story ever since I first read it. So Judith and I are just going to go through it a little bit. If you have questions, you are more than welcome to tweet. We'll all be keeping an eye on my Twitter account, which is OHaliciaJo, OHALICIAJO, and you can tweet questions right there, and we'll try to get to them as they arise. So, Judith, you want to start reading?
Sure. Are we doing this in English?
I think so, yeah.
We can point things out in Hebrew if we need to.
That sounds great.
Okay. When they were in Hatzerot, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman he had married, saying he married a Cushite woman. One of the things that I notice here is in the Hebrew is that the verb form tidaber is actually a feminine form, right? So it's kind of interesting in terms of, though they're saying that Moses and Aaron spoke together, that there is some sense that, that Miriam and Aaron spoke together, there's some sense that Miriam is somehow highlighted here.
Which is something that the rabbis will definitely jump on later. They said, has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well? The Lord heard it. Now, one thing that I noticed, it's a very different complaint than the complaint in verse 1. So the complaint in verse 1 seems to be something about this marriage of Moses's. And then in verse 2, there's this other issue of Moses being elevated above Miriam and Aaron and sort of the specific prophecy that only gets to come through Moses and the power dynamic among the siblings, which is completely different. I'm intrigued by those two criticisms right next to each other.
Yeah. It's also confusing to know who the Cushite woman is. Like, is this Zipporah, who we've already heard about as Moses' wife, but she wasn't a Cushite? So what, are we talking about another person here, or what? It's also very vague about what is the what is the speaking against? They're just stating a fact. He married a Cushite woman, but what is the criticism that's implicit there?
Yeah, so there's already, I think one of the things I love so much about this story is there's already so much both room for midrash, room for commentary, because, rabbinic commentary, midrash, as we know, fills in the gaps that the text leaves, and there are so many gaps already. And the other thing is that it also feels very relatable of, sibling rivalry is eternal, and jostling for power is also eternal, and so it's written so long ago, but I can really imagine this happening in some boardroom or some kind of family reunion today, which I find very compelling.
Absolutely. I'm picturing them now at Thanksgiving dinner.
Exactly.
Now, Moses was a very humble man, more so than any other man on earth. Which, again, here seems like, first of all, it's something we already, I think, sort of know about Moses, and it's also my question here is sort of where does this come from? Why does this need to be inserted here? Why is his humility a factor? And maybe it has to do with this dynamic between the three siblings. Maybe it has to do, with how he might respond to criticism, but we don't really know.
Yeah. Suddenly the Lord called to Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, "Come out, you three, to the tent of meeting." So the three of them went out.
The Lord came down in a pillar of cloud, stopped at the entrance of the tent, and called out, "Aaron and Miriam." The two of them came forward.
And God said, "Hear these my words. When a prophet of the Lord arises among you, I make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream."
Not so with my servant Moses. He's trusted throughout my household.
With him I speak mouth to mouth, plainly and not in riddles, and he beholds the likeness of the Lord. How then did you not shrink from speaking against my servant Moses?
Still incensed with them, the Lord departed.
As the cloud withdrew from the tent, there was Miriam, stricken with snow-white scales. When Aaron turned toward Miriam, he saw that she was stricken with scales.
And Aaron said to Moses, "O my Lord, account not to us the sin which we committed in our folly.
Let her not be as one dead who emerges from his mother's womb with half his flesh eaten away."
So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "O God, pray heal her."
But the Lord said to Moses, "If her father spat in her face, would she not bear her shame for 7 days? Let her be shut out of camp for 7 days, and then let her be readmitted."
So Miriam was shut out of camp for 7 days, and the people did not march on until Miriam was readmitted.
After that, the people set out from Hatzerot and encamped in the wilderness of Paran. So, as you may know, this idea of the scaly white skin is something that comes up here and there in Torah. It's translated leprosy. In Hebrew, it's sara'at. And it is not what we consider medical leprosy today. That's a separate disease. This is considered to be a spiritual disease, often connected in the rabbinic mind with speaking slander, but definitely some sort of spiritual punishment or effect of behavior and attitude. And so it's, the treatment for it is basically to do this separation and immersing and then returning to camp.
But maybe let's take a step back and just look at that encounter between God and Moses and Aaron and Miriam and how the kind of punishment comes down. One of the things that I notice immediately, first of all, maybe this is just because I'm a parent, but I feel like you can hear this kind of, God has this kind of tone of like, the three of you come out here right now. we have some business to take care of. But then even though God calls all three of them out and calls them to, come together, he then calls out Aaron and Miriam specifically for, whatever criticism he's going to give them. And then he makes a distinction between Moses and Aaron and Miriam in terms of the kind of prophecy that Moses represents, that Moses has like a different level of connection to God, a different kind of closeness and access and intimacy. And as a parent, I sort of find that interesting in that he's, it seems like often we try, I have twins, so I'm often in the situation of kids comparing themselves to one another, and I feel like generally conventional wisdom is you don't try to say, like, this kid is better than all the other ones, but here we have a clear kind of hierarchy that's being placed there. So in terms of that question of sibling rivalry and sibling dynamics that Alicia brought up, it's you can see that there's real tension there.
It's true, and I think that fairness is a huge question in this passage in general, because first there's this power distinction that God says, oh no, there is a favorite. Don't worry, it's Moses, you are not it. And then in verse 9, God departs and Miriam is stricken with snow white scales, and it doesn't really say anything about Aaron being stricken with snow white scales here, although as we may see if we get to it, there is a rabbinic theory that maybe Aaron also was, but it does clearly beg the question, and this is often one of the primary responses to this text, is that it just seems so unfair that Aaron and Miriam say something together and Miriam is punished, and Aaron doesn't seem to be from a simple reading of the text.
Right. But one of the things that I really love about this is that the line in verse 15 that, so Miriam is separated for 7 days, but the people don't march on until she returns to the camp. So there's this sense that even though she's been isolated in her punishment, that she is still, the community insists on waiting for her, and there's clearly a real sense of commitment and connection from, the Israelite community to Miriam, and not really breaking their tie with her here.
It's true, and I also love that in verse 13, Moses himself cries out to God, praying for God to heal Miriam, even though Miriam was punished for criticizing Moses. And I think that from a literary perspective, the kind of checks and balances within this text are part of what makes it so fascinating and powerful. That is, the distinction that God makes between the power relationship between the siblings, but then the siblings themselves are sort of overturning that. And then, as Judith pointed out, the whole community is showing great respect for Miriam by waiting to keep traveling.
Yeah, and the Hebrew of Moses' prayer is so beautiful and poetic. El na rafa na la. It's very concise and sort of melodic, and is kind of the kind of core prayer for healing that we have in our tradition.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the core prayer for healing that we have in our tradition is responding to a sickness that God seems to have brought as well, from theologically.
Right.
Judith, what do you think about this whole verse 14, the father spitting in her face?
Yeah, I was going to ask you what you make of that, because I know it's something that you focus on in your, in your song midrash about this. But, and I was thinking about this, like, is God here meant to be the father? It seems like there's kind of a parallel there, that God is saying, well, not only is there the punishment itself, but then there's this kind of 7 days of shame that follows the punishment. Like, is spitting in the face not enough? There then has to be this shame that one has to bear after it. And it's kind of an interesting, I was trying to sort of think, like, what does that mean? That there's the punishment, and then there's the need to bear the shame out for a longer period of time, and the punishment itself is not enough in some ways.
That's interesting. I never focused on that. I love that, what you're noticing about it. Because I got so kind of gripped by the idea that God seems to be comparing God's self to a father spitting in his daughter's face, which is so awful, that I thought, why would God use that as the analogy? And I actually wasn't focusing on the second part of that, which is there is this ongoing time-bound effect as well of it. And, I don't really have an answer for this. In a way, I just find it, perhaps because I'm also a parent, but I thought this before I was a parent, that there's just such a human tendency to self-justify, and in a way, God is saying, well, this is the rule and there's nothing else to do, and in a way that does seem to be a divine self-justification. But, and maybe there was, maybe it was such a patriarchal time that it didn't have maybe the idea of a father spitting in his daughter's face didn't have quite the cringing effect that I think it has now, but I also think that it did. I mean, I think that's part of why it made it in there, because it's such a strong image. And I don't really have an answer, but I think there's something so compelling and kind of juicy about God describing God's action that way, as God kind of, the rebuke to God's own daughter being, I mean, there are so many faces of God in Torah. There's so many ways that God behaves, and I think in a way there's something refreshingly honest about God saying that sometimes it feels like God's spitting in your face. That's something that I think that we experience as humans, but think that we should be able to see the deeper test and trial and meaningfulness of it. And I think there's something that I find fascinating about God saying, oh, this really terrible thing happens from me to you sometimes, and then there's protocol, and I can't overturn the protocol either.
Right. So I'm not sure, I mean, except in the fact that this is meant to be a punishment, I don't really see acknowledgement from God that this is a horrible act. Like, I think that's part of what I find so disturbing about it, is it feels like a very, not just, it's the kind of act that's so intimate and close. And it's kind of interesting when you think about the fact that part of what God's saying about, like, God's closeness to Moses being this direct, mouth to mouth, and then the mouth to face interaction between God and Miriam is one of spitting. Like, it just feels horrible and really like a kind of very, visceral kind of insult, and yet God is not in any way, and maybe I'm just bringing too modern a sense of this to the text, but there is no sense from God of saying, like, okay, well, maybe that was, it feels like such an act of anger, such an act of in the moment, and not necessarily something that's part of, like, the second part of it of, we have this protocol that if someone has tzara'at, they are separated from the camp for 7 days. It's kind of benign. It's like, if A happens, then B happens. But there's nothing benign about the spitting in the face kind of metaphor. And that just feels so much wrapped up in, like, anger and this kind of visceral, very physical response.
I agree. And I think that's part of the reason I wanted to write about this passage, and that's part of the trouble in Girls in Trouble, is that I think as disturbing as it is, I think it would be more disturbing if the sort of violence and unfairness that we see in the world around us were absent from the Torah.
Right.
And I sometimes talk about how I didn't grow up with a strong Torah background, and I sort of assumed that it was a book of people maybe having challenges, but ultimately doing the right thing and sort of serving as models for us humans. And when I turned 21 and went to Jerusalem to study at Pardes and started to study the text, I had been an English major, and I was actually profoundly relieved to find that the same depth of unfairness and ambiguity that I had seen in Shakespeare or any number of other literary works that probably are influenced by these texts themselves, but to see them in our foundational text and to see them reflected as a central part of life, that it is not comforting in some ways that God speaks in this way, and then in other ways I find that it is comforting that this story is as complex and sort of unsolvable as some of the dilemmas that we're presented with in real life.
Right, and it kind of, two things about that. One is that I feel like it disrupts a little bit the kind of, I think, sort of Christian ideas that we have, images that we might have of God as being sort of perfect and, only perfect, and instead suggests that, well, the God of the Old Testament particularly is extremely moody and violent and sometimes kind of immature in certain kinds of ways of reacting, like flies off the handle. And then, of course, as humans created in the image of God, in some ways it gives us more permission to kind of own those parts of ourselves as being the imperfect parts of ourselves as potentially also things that we see reflected in God. But I also, in terms of thinking about the story of Miriam in particular, when you think back to all the other places where she appears in the text, they're often moments that are really associated with violence. You know, she appears in the story, the beginning of the story with the birth of Moses and the killing of all of the Hebrew baby boys, and she manages to save him, but she has to kind of interrupt that violence that's happening and insert herself into the middle of it. She sings the Song of the Sea, which is, you know, after, it's a moment of celebration, but it's after all of this violence of all of the Egyptians dying in the sea, not to mention the violence of the death of the firstborn. And then even after the story, you know, one of the things that's one of the midrashim about Miriam talks about her having this magic well that keeps the people with water in the wilderness, and that comes about because right after her death, the Bible mentions, the text mentions that there's a drought, that the people don't have any water, and so the connection that's made there is that Miriam provided water. But we get that piece of the story of Miriam being the provider of water really with the absence of water and the idea of dying of thirst, and so there's so much violence that's wrapped up in her story, let alone this, you know, even if we look at just all the other places where she appears in the text.
That's true, and I think in a way that's sort of part of my, if I have an agenda with Girls in Trouble, I think that Miriam is rightfully celebrated for leading this triumphant song at the sea and being this female prophet and leader, but the way that she's celebrated is often in a kind of, you know, a context of pure joy, which I think disregards a little bit exactly what you're saying, that so many of those moments of redemption were coming out of violence and difficulty. And the reason I think it's important to return to that is not because of some morbid fascination exclusively, but I think because it's just such a part of real lived experience that we may have moments of stasis and long stretches of beauty, and that's wonderful, but we're going to come up against difficulty and violence in the world around us and in our lives, and strife. And I think that to sort of take the joyful aspects of Miriam out and hold them up is only getting half the story. And I think that to bring the other half of the story in, and all these things that Judith just mentioned, is to contextualize our own lives as normal, even in their darkest moments of trial. That's an essential part of being human, and it's an essential part of developing strength, and the kind of victory and song that Miriam brings out of those moments would not have happened without the difficulty of those moments, presumably. So with that, maybe I'll sing my song about Miriam.
Great.
And I do want to mention also that part of the reason we're talking about this, and I'm doing this song, is as a way of beginning to talk about this curriculum that I'm writing, which is a curriculum that's going to allow individuals and educators to take my songs into the classroom, into podcasts in their car, into video, different aspects of bringing these songs that I've been writing and using them as a way to encounter these stories of women in Torah. And so I'd love to talk, if any of you are watching this now or recorded and want to talk to me about the curriculum or using it in your community, you can always get in touch with me. I'm pretty easy to find. So here is my song about Miriam. If you have the source sheet, it's on the second page of the lyrics, and it's called Snow, Scorpions, and Spiders. And it mentions a lot of the earlier parts of Miriam's life that Judith was just talking about as well. Well, my mother named me bitter, although as a child I was so kind, hiding myself in the trees to watch over my brother. But still my name was bitter, bitter the taste of the sea, bitter the cries of the horses drowning behind us. If anybody had asked me, I might not have chosen to go. But everyone knows sometimes you don't have a choice. So when I said you're banished 7 days in the desert alone, I just started walking, I knew there was nothing to say. The scorpions and the spiders crawled up to me and stopped in my shade. Together in silence we watched as the sun crossed the sky. This is the glockenspiel solo, but my player isn't here right now. And if your father spit in your face, wouldn't you want to leave that place? And if your skin should turn to snow, wouldn't you have to go? And if your God should turn from you, wouldn't you turn to? Still I don't regret a minute, and I don't regret an hour of the week that I lived all alone at the top of the mountain. Though no voice came down from heaven, and I never saw words written in fire, I did see the birds of prey pick all the carcasses clean. If anybody had asked me, I might not have chosen to go. But everyone knows sometimes you don't have a choice. And if your father spit in your face, wouldn't you want to leave that place? And if your skin should turn to snow, wouldn't you have to go? And if your God should turn from you, wouldn't you turn to? Oh, I have to say it's freezing in my little office here because it's sort of an outdoor office and my strings went a little out of tune, but that's live music.
So I realized listening to your song that we didn't mention one other thing about the text. I mean, I'm sure there are many things we didn't mention, but one of the things we didn't mention about the text is that throughout this whole story, even though it's a story that starts with Moses, with Miriam and Aaron speaking, we actually don't hear Miriam's voice at all throughout this whole piece. And part of what I just love about this song and about your work with Girls in Trouble is how you give this first-person perspective, you know, from to the story, and how you reinsert Miriam into the story, and we get to hear her voice. So there's that piece, which I think is so important. But at the same time, the angle that you've chosen in terms of what, you know, the story that you tell in her voice is really about her walking away and actually not engaging.
Yeah, well, you know, when I write these songs, I read the text a lot. I think about my take on it. I start reading other midrashic commentaries and looking at visual art and just thinking about all kinds of takes on it. And then I try to find a take on the story that feels really authentic to me, that could be someone living a similar moment now. It might not be literally exactly the same story, but I kind of think, like, what would my response to this be if this happened, or when is the time I felt similar in my life, and how did that feel inside? And when I hit on the place that feels like it's sort of 50% my inner response and 50% the particulars of the story, and they resonate together, that intersection is where I sort of write the song from. So I mean, honestly, as I read this song as I read the story over and over, I thought about these 7 days outside the camp, and I thought, like, she has such a long history of being extremely faithful and of providing for her people, of being this leader. And then there is this slap in the face or a spit in the face from God, as acknowledged by God. And whether or not God thinks it's a problem, I can't imagine she would think it was a problem. And in my imagination, I encourage everyone to go make their own. I don't want to, like, define this story for anyone, but this is my take on it. And so I thought maybe there is a sort of Torah of the wilderness and a Torah of being outside the community that Miriam found that she could discover in a way that she maybe would have missed if she had stayed on the inside all her life. And as someone who was on the inside all her life, maybe she learned something from being in exile. I mean, I also kind of, I mean, exile is dramatic, but from being put outside the camp to be cleansed, at least. And I also thought about the parallelism between Moses being sort of called out from the camp and called up the mountain to receive the Torah. So Moses is called to get as close as possible to God. And it seems that Miriam is sort of called out to be alone, farther from God. And I think because I do believe there is a Torah in the difficult moments as well as a Torah in the moments of beauty, Torah in the sense of teaching and connection, I wanted to explore what it might feel like to be out there, and if there was anything besides simply a feeling of anger that she might have experienced. So that's where I was coming from.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I was really struck by that comparison that you make at the end about, that the experience she has is not the voice coming down from heaven or, words written in fire, but it's the experience of what, kind of like this violent process that is nature of the, the bird of prey picking the carcass clean, and that there's some kind of wisdom in that as well, even if it's not that kind of revelation that rocks the earth. It just is what is.
Yeah, and I was just working on my draft of the curriculum of this, and I was mentioning how it's also influenced by a night that I spent. I decided when I was in Jerusalem studying Torah, we had a break from school, and I decided to go to the desert and spend the night just alone. I didn't have a tent, I just had a sleeping bag, and so I just kind of snuck off into some nature preserve and spent the night alone in the desert. And I woke up in the middle of the night, and there was this gigantic spider right next to my sleeping bag, and I didn't have any walls to protect me from this spider, so I sort of just stared it down. And then he ran away, and I ended up just drawing a circle, kind of like Choni. I just drew a circle around my sleeping bag. I was like, that's all I can do is draw a circle. And somehow I went back to sleep and woke up in the morning, and everything was fine. But I felt like that was some sort of little visitation of this spider. And so when I thought about Miriam for 7 days out there on her own, I thought about her being exposed to the desert in a way that maybe she had never been in the center of the community, since she had been in the center of the community. And I thought about, the Israelites are experiencing Torah for the first time in the desert. Like, Moses has received it, and they're sort of participating in the laws of Torah explicitly for the first time, interacting with this document that has specific punishments and a specific set of laws and rules and social mores and all those things. And so this just seemed like such the literal opposite of that, to be alone in the desert without any protection, out among nature. And I did exactly what you're saying. Like, I did want to think about what you learn from that, and maybe the sort of unfairness, and that is actually echoed in human interactions, in the human rules that we create around ourselves, whether or not we want it to be.
Right, and you get that sense of the vulnerability, but at the same time, what I'm struck by, as opposed to your story of staring down the spider, is in this version, the spider and the scorpion actually are protected by Miriam because they come into her shade. So in some ways, instead of there being this kind of like, confrontation between the two of them, there's almost this communal sense, like, here we are, outcasts or feared things together, and we can take comfort in one another and protect one another. And it's like she's finding a way to make common cause in some ways with the other things of the desert, even though at the same time I'm really struck by the whole snow piece, because here they are in the desert and you have the desert imagery and snow just don't quite seem to fit. I mean, I guess there is snow in the desert, but I think of the Israelites in the desert and sort of the heat and the sand and the rocks, and here you've got the scorpions and the spider, and then there's this image of snow of like not fitting in quite.
Yeah, which I find in the original story, these snow white scales. It's like, what is that snow? I mean, I know it's maybe the whitest thing they could imagine, but what a strange thing to appear in the middle of the desert.
Right.
And there is, this is something I was also putting in this curriculum I'm working on. There's this interesting sort of strain in Talmudic commentary of looking at spiders and scorpions and snakes and these sort of scary, slithery things, and flipping them on their heads as seeing them as both dangerous and potentially very healing, which to me resonates with something that I keep talking about in this hour that I'm so interested in, which is the potential for healing and revelation in the midst of specifically the most difficult things. Mm-hmm. That was another thing I saw in this story. I love that the rabbis kind of also seem to have an idea of that.
Right. I was also struck by the whole idea of choice and regret here, that, she sort of says, if anybody had asked me, I might not have chosen to go, which I don't know if you meant that in the context of going out for 7 days out of the camp or if you meant leaving Egypt, but it reminded me of just that sense of ambivalence that is built into this story that we don't hear from Miriam in the Torah, but perhaps existed for her too. And it also creates an echo for me of Lot's wife, who didn't want to leave Sodom and turned around and looked back, and just it raised for me that question actually of gender, which we haven't really talked about here, of just her being somebody who didn't have a choice in how she was treated as a woman. There were going to be certain rules perhaps for her and certain ways in which she might be disempowered, and that question of choice there. And then, but also you're saying she doesn't have any regrets, and she doesn't regret the time that she had in the desert. She doesn't necessarily, the implication might be she doesn't even regret the action that sent her there, perhaps.
Yeah. And I mean, thinking of that, it's also interesting that the Israelites, are often referred to as this bride of God and kind of feminized as a tribe, and that maybe, the entire Exodus in a way was something that they were pretty ambivalent about,
right?
About leaving this place, but that we essentially don't have choices so much of the time. Even in our own participation in revelation, we don't necessarily have a choice. I mean, even in our own growth. Yeah. Do you want to look at these visual images on the next page of the handout?
Can I ask one more question about this?
Absolutely.
Which is about your decision to end the song with and if your God should turn from you, wouldn't you turn too? So I was wondering how you saw that as the kind of resolution of the song and the resolution of the story, and is there something there about something being sort of irreparably broken between Miriam and God? And in some ways, I feel like the way that the song ends, it does feel a little bit unfinished in a certain way, like it. So it really provoked that question for me. Like, is there some way in which this doesn't feel like a healing at the end?
Yeah, well, and musically, I mean, I think part of the unfinished is that I end on a 5 chord, which is, like, musically speaking, is not resolved. So I don't kind of, like, answer. Yeah, for sure. I wanted to dwell in that place of ambiguity because that's what this story feels like to me. And kind of as you were pointing out before, there are these sort of terrible aspects of the story, and there are these beautiful aspects of the community waiting for her, and it's not a simple story, and it doesn't really have a simple resolution. And I like to think about, like, so she goes out for 7 days, and then she comes back, and then the people continue with her, and then what, then, like, how do you, like you're saying, how do you heal from something like that? And I didn't exactly want to answer that question or say, like, you never can heal from something like that, but I think part of what I wanted to do is going back to something you said earlier, is to give her some agency in the story. And this is something that I often find myself doing, and is looking at a story of a woman in Torah and seeing sometimes the text gives her a tremendous amount of agency, and I have to be clear that I've been really impressed by the amount of times that the Torah depicts a woman in a patriarchal situation with very little power, and then in that story itself, the woman uses anything at her disposal to change her destiny, change the destiny often of her people, and she flips it around, and it's not a later apologetic, it's in the story. So I think that that's something that's, when we talk about the patriarchy and things like that, I think it's also important to just acknowledge the power of these particular stories. But there are a few where the woman is quite silent, and this is one of them. And I think this is one where, instead of just amplifying the voice that I hear in the original text, I wanted to actually insert a little bit of a voice. And to me, it's kind of a simple voice, or a simple idea of a complicated voice, which is just, I don't know, like, I can't really imagine her just sitting outside the camp and crying for 7 days, saying, I just can't wait to get back into this situation. I can't wait to return to God and be in God's good graces again. And in some ways, with God giving that father spitting analogy, I feel like there is something that happens where women, men also, but women grow up to a certain point where they say, I no longer want to be part of a relationship on these terms. And that can be explicit, or it can just be internal, like you can walk away physically, or you can walk away just internally and sort of say, I want peace, and I'm happy to sort of play along. It doesn't have to be a huge dramatic, I'm out of here. But there's a point at which I think, like, I can imagine Miriam just saying, if this is really how you think a daughter should be treated, then maybe I can't really fully be your daughter anymore in the same way. And I just imagine that. I have a hard time imagining anything else after that statement of God's. I would love to see someone else's imagining of a different resolution, but with the material that I have from the original text, that's just kind of where my mind goes next.
Right. And there is this sense here in your rendition that she is a very kind of self-sufficient, independent person, even as a child. I mean, when we think back to the places where she appears in the story, even as a child, she's given a lot of independence. Even in there's a midrash of her as a 5 or 6 year old, basically challenging her parents, her father particularly, who, according to the story, has divorced her mother, and encouraging them to get back together so that they can continue to procreate. And so there's this sense that she, even as a small child, is really taking care of herself and taking care of others, and she watches over Moses, and she's a very independent character. And I think you really capture that here, that a certain loneliness, but also a sense of self-sufficiency, which I think is very powerful.
And I was talking to someone who pointed out recently that somehow I had not actually noticed that she's one of maybe the only major kind of matriarchal type character who doesn't get married and have kids in the original text. I mean, there's a midrash about maybe her getting married, but it's just not mentioned, which is incredible, actually, in terms of what you're saying. And, now that you've mentioned that, I sort of feel like, because, especially if people are watching this later, they may not have the visual art that I had put together to talk about. So I'll just mention about the visual art that I find it really fascinating as well to look at visual depictions of these stories, from Jewish and Christian and non-religious sources. And I find that to be also an aspect of midrash, where people have to make midrashic decisions about, was Miriam an old woman kind of crouching uncomfortably with her empty basket in front of a door, or was she a beautiful young woman sort of beatifically kneeling to get Aaron's cleansing of her? So these are two of the images that I put together. And so in the curriculum, there's going to be a visual art element, because I just think it's an amazing way into the characters. But there's also some really wonderful original rabbinic midrashim. And if you do have the source sheets, it's on the last page. This goes back to what Judith was just saying about the idea that Miriam was responsible for bringing her parents back together when they were being abstinent for a while. And this is this interesting strain of Miriam's character, which is not quite in the original text, but it's very much in the rabbinic imagination. So do you want to read this one? It's the first Midrash 1 in English. Sure.
Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses. So that's the piece of the Torah text that they're going to now reflect on. How did Miriam know that Moses had separated from the commandment of be fruitful and multiply? Because she saw that his wife was no longer wearing jewelry. She said to her, "Why have you stopped wearing jewelry?" His wife answered, "Your brother is not diligent about the matter of marital conjugation." Then Miriam knew and spoke to Aaron, and the two of them spoke against Moses.
So I really loved this midrash because, again, this is commenting on like what's wrong with this Cushite woman, and we tend to first read it as they're criticizing him for marrying someone else for some reason. But this rabbi is imagining that they're actually criticizing Moses for not sleeping with his wife, which is considered to be an obligation on the husband. And this echoes this early action of Miriam addressing this problem with her parents as well. I mean, I don't know, do you have like an initial response to this midrash, Judith?
Yeah, it is really interesting. It's like, on the one hand, I love the subtext, which I think is part of like the sex positivity of Judaism, that basically the rabbis are arguing that like even if you are a prophet who is so close to God, you cannot abandon your human relationships and your sexual relationships, and that is an essential aspect of humanity. So that part I love, and it's also, I mean, it feels like it's a little bit far from the text because ostensibly that would be a criticism of Moses, but we know that Moses is actually sort of being defended by God here, so I'm not quite sure how that part fits in. But it's particularly interesting given what you pointed out about the fact that Miriam herself never marries, and so here she kind of appears in the text as like the police for other people's intimate relationships, like to make sure that other marriages are being fully expressed in every way, and yet she's not part of that herself. So it is kind of an interesting role that she then is given here.
Yeah, it is. Another thing that I love about this is that the camera suddenly shifts to the relationship between this imagined conversation between Miriam and Moses' Cushite wife, which is not at all in the original text. But to think about the rabbis imagining, the source of this whole crazy episode is that there's this secret language of women, that women know how to read each other's signs, and Miriam saw that this woman was no longer wearing jewelry and approaches her about it, and through that finds out this very intimate detail about her life with Moses. It just casts the story in a very different light, where it's no longer necessarily about power among the siblings, and it becomes a little more about it feels a little bit like a sisterhood is powerful. Miriam is defending this kind of voiceless woman. She's like, "Oh no, I'm going to stand up for you," But right. Just the fact that the rabbis would zoom in on that is pretty fascinating to me.
Right, and there's this real sense of women being so attuned to each other's even nonverbal communication and being so attuned to these details. And I love also that it switches it from assuming the story is a criticism of the Cushite wife to instead being about being her supporter and being her advocate. It also, there's something about it, this idea isn't fully formed, but there's something about it that sparks for me some thoughts, I'm not quite sure where they go, but about the relationship then between this and the story of the golden calf, which is built out of women's jewelry that they are giving up and donating to this project. So it's very, I don't know, it's like if you think about women's jewelry as somehow being connected to their intimate relationships with their partners and being about that, that human interchange of beauty and being perceived, and then those being given to the golden cat. I don't know. I don't quite know how to work it out, but I feel like there's some interesting echo there.
Yeah, I think I feel like I remember there being a connection between the golden calf midrashically and that other midrash about the women seducing their husbands in Egypt when they were too tired, and that the copper mirrors that they used to seduce their husbands then became, so it is linked. And you had mentioned like how odd snow is in the context of this story, and I agree, and I also love how odd jewelry is in the context of this story, and something that I think of as so kind of extraneous, and it's like such a female ornamentation, I think of it, and to put that as like a kind of secret sign that triggers an entire complicated episode, including God having to defend Moses, and these huge kind of and the entire community not traveling for a week in the desert. There's just something very kind of topsy-turvy about it that I'm really drawn to.
Right, but it also speaks to me about some of that. It reminds me of the story of Miriam at the crossing of the sea when she and the women dance with their timbrels, right? And there's that raises the question of like, wait a second, what are these people doing with timbrels? And I think it's a similar question, like, what are they doing with jewelry in the desert? Aren't these the same people who were in such a rush to leave that they didn't have a chance to let their bread rise, and that's why we eat matzah? So like, how is it that they didn't have time to fully bake their bread, and yet they managed to remember to pack timbrels and jewelry? And I think it really speaks to like remembering that this is a community, and to our like all the different levels of our humanity. And it reminds me, and I feel like there is a particular kind of women's wisdom in that. It actually reminds me of the 20th century American Jewish labor activist Rose Schneiderman, who kind of spoke out about the idea of women needing bread and roses too. And to me, like the timbrel and the jewelry are the roses, right? Like it's not just about basic survival. Obviously, the story of the Exodus from Egypt is in large part about basic survival, but if you're going to continue to live in the fullness of what it means to live, it also means that you need the roses, the things that make life beautiful, the things that are about, festivity, that are about celebration, that are about human connection, that aren't just about basic survival. And part of what Miriam offers the story, sort of by suggestion, is the memory of that we need to sing, we need to dance, we need to have musical instruments, we need that as part of the fullness of our life. It's part of what we need to survive, and maybe the jewelry is a piece of that too.
I love that idea. And one last thought is I was speaking with a wonderful scholar named Dina Aronoff, and she was saying that I was mentioning how the stories of women are often so complex, and I'm so drawn to the domestic dramas that often play out. And she was saying that part of that is perhaps because there's so much pressure on the men's stories to be sort of held up as the patriarchs for an ongoing people and to be examples, and that there's a little less pressure in some way on the women in these stories because it is a patriarchal society, and because of that, some of the more real-life details can actually come out in the women's stories, and some of the more just kind of resonant, complicated shadings that we experience in our lives actually are passed down through the women's stories. So there's two other wonderful midrashim, and of course, thousands and thousands of other ones that aren't on the source sheet. But I would love to invite anyone who's interested to talk to me more. There's going to be 10 characters in this curriculum. And also Girls in Trouble is going to be releasing a new album next winter that'll have Lot's wife with a number of other women's stories interpreted in songs. And I'm so grateful, Judith, to you for having this conversation with me on a Sunday.
Oh, this is so much fun. It's really, really great, and I love working with you, and I hope that all of you will follow the rest of Alicia's work and also follow what JWA is doing. You can check us out at jwa.org or on Twitter at JWA Online or Facebook. And, you know, I'd love to be able to continue these conversations about Jewish women's lives and what we learn from them.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.